We're BUILD, which is the support group in TE for parents who have kids with all types of learning differences. So parents who have kids with 504 plans, maybe you have an IEP, maybe you have a gifted IEP, maybe your child is a 2E, twice exceptional child, or maybe you just are starting to get evaluated and you're, have some questions and concerns. We're here to help everybody, and this is a really important initiative of ours called Everyone Reads TE. These ladies are going to tell you a little bit more about it.
I'm Kate Mayer. We, as Wendy said, we are an initiative of BUILD, and we were born out of our own experiences with our own children, but with the ended up with the desire to make sure that the simplest educational building block reading was accessible to all students in the district. So not just kids with IEPs, 504s, but all kids in the district. Our mission is to ensure that all students in TE learn to read to the best of their potential, with as little emotional impact as possible by using instructional practices rooted in the science of reading. We want to thank the teachers, the administration, the school board, and parents, all of you, for partnering with us on this journey. It is not a short journey. We're making strides, and we're really excited to have these partnerships. And one of the things that we want to highlight tonight is that on this handout you got, this is kind of the parent handout. It has some questionnaires if you're heading on into conferences and have questions about reading, or if you have a child in reading support and have questions. But we also have two things that we're offering to all parents, teachers, administrators, and people in the district for the next couple weeks. And one is a free course that's on the Basics of Dyslexia. If you're a teacher, you get Act 48 Hours, and we purchased it as a group for everyone because we thought it was so important to offer this. So if you are interested, make sure you take advantage of it over the next 2 weeks, because it ends at the end of the month. And then lastly, we have this partnership with the International Dyslexia Association, the Pennsylvania branch, and they have an event coming up this weekend where they're offering scholarships to everyone in TE. So it's really interesting. Marianne Wolf will be presenting. She's one of the prominent brain researchers when it comes to science, and she's introducing a new topic, which is the reading brain in the digital age. So it's not only interesting for teachers, but parents as we embark on this new age in terms of literacy. So this is Jamie Lynch, and she's going to tell you a little bit about Earl, who's presenting tonight.
Hi. So tonight we are really happy to introduce Earl Oremus. He is Headmaster Emeritus of Marburn Academy. He was the former headmaster there for 27 years. Marburn Academy is a school for children who learn differently in the Columbus area, and also has a mission to improve the quality of education available to people with learning differences throughout Central Ohio and the state. Mr. Oremus is here to talk to you tonight about the scientific base of reading instruction and what the science says about reading instruction for all students. He's here because he's done this work. All of the things he's going to share with you are things he has done over the past 3 decades with students who were unsuccessful in the traditional balanced literacy environment. Please welcome him here tonight.
And I'm just going to add, we're taping this meeting. It's everybody's backs. That's being taped. It's really to hear our wonderful speaker and allow people who weren't able to come to the meeting tonight to be able to hear them. So I just want to give everybody the heads up. Thanks.
Thank you all for asking me to come and be a part of this. So I've spent a long time in my life working with parent groups and supporters in my own school, and then found that there were a lot of other schools looking for the same kinds of things. And over 30 years or so, we found out some things that work with these children. And along the way, one of the things that helped so much was that there's a body of research that I want to spend considerable time sharing with you tonight that actually provided terrific guidance. Sometimes it was guidance away from things that we were doing that we thought were the right things, but they weren't. And other times it was guidance towards things that actually worked better for the kids. So our school was a private, not-for-profit school for kids who hadn't been able to make education really work for them in their neighborhood school. None of these were families who were choosing a private school because they thought that private school was the way you're supposed to go. They all came because their children didn't seem to be able to make it work for them in the other programs. So our role was to figure out programs that did work for them. If their issue was that they had a lot of difficulty learning to read, we wanted to be able to teach in a way where the opposite happened, where they're really good. If it was math, fine. If there were ADHD kids and they had issues with what we would call self-management skills, we wanted to know how to teach those self-management skills. So this is a part of what has been for me the core of my work as a person in this world, and it's always thrilling to be asked by some other people to come and share information with them. There are quite a number of things we learned the hard way in doing this. When I arrived there at my school in 1987, we were a little school of 70 children, all of whom did not know how to read. And I had 14 faculty members, none of whom know how to teach them to read. So that wasn't actually solving the problem. Our school had developed some wonderful strategies, though, for helping kids feel better about the fact that they didn't know how to read. And so the school had stayed alive for a couple of years on that. But long term, we really had to know how to teach them to read. And so part of what I want to talk about is that journey. And it's an honor to be asked to share that stuff in the hopes that some of it may be useful to you. So, those of you all sitting out there, some of you are parents and you're thinking about these questions for your children. Some of you are school people, you're thinking about how they as a school and their other colleagues in the school can work on these issues and make it work. And so I hope for you that it turns out well. Turned out okay for us. 3 years ago, when I first started working in Marburn, we rented a 1952 elementary school building from a surplus school from the Columbus Public School Business. And I can tell you that if they had a surplus school, it was not one you would want your kid to be in. And so for a long time, our sort of internal joke at the school was we were in a great school, but we do it in a chicken coop. And 3 years ago, we celebrated the fact that we acquired 17 acres of land and we opened a school building for 350 of these children. And it's a state of the art. So, now it's like we've moved from the chicken coop to the palace. So it's very reinforcing to know that, over that long haul, you can actually figure these things out and make it work. So my goal tonight is to share some of this with you. Okay, so here's the idea of what we're going to do. I made a few notes so I don't ramble on too much on this part and then forget to get to all the good stuff. So I want to start out by talking about context here. These discussions about what's going on when kids struggle to learn to read and how could we respond in a way that would make it better, they've been going on for a very, very long time. And today we live in an educational environment where almost culture-wide discussions about reading and how it should be taught and how kids learn, those decisions were made and incorporated into the way schools do their business, starting back in the 20s and 30s and 40s when John Dewey's ideas about what he called constructivist learning began to excite people and were incorporated in many areas of schooling and great results in many areas of schooling. But what also happened was those decisions wound up getting incorporated into the teaching of reading. And so that context of those decisions being made out of enthusiasm for new ideas about learning, but in the absence of good science that tells you whether these ideas are going to work or not, we live today with the result of those decisions. The great thing about our context today, though, is we live in an environment where there is an astonishing body of reliable research that actually does guide us in making those kinds of decisions as we go forward. So, part of what I do is I want to talk about that whole body of research, how it came to be and why it's trustworthy. Then from there on, it's all about stuff that we've learned from the research. One is, how does the brain actually learn to read? What happens neurologically when that goes on? And the other part of that question is, well, what's happening or not happening when that doesn't work. So it's helpful to know those things, because once you know that, then you can start looking at what are the steps you're supposed to go through, and then if there are problems, what are the sources of the problems, and what is the research base and what is the experiential base that people have now of how to do things that address those problems and have these kids be successful. So that's the plan for tonight. Those of you who are hoping for an early night, you don't actually have the research data, but if this is enough for you, feel free to grab a bagel or something and head on. That's okay with me. All right, I got to mention 2 words. When I was on the debate team at the University of Kentucky, my debate coach drilled into me, always start out with your definition of terms so people know that you mean what they think you mean. So I'm going to use the word dyslexia a lot tonight, and not every kid who has trouble reading is dyslexic, or maybe they are, but they aren't diagnosed as dyslexic. What dyslexia has really meant over the years has evolved. Now, a good chunk of this very important science I want to talk to you about has looked at this whole issue of dyslexia, and here's what it means today, technically. It means a child that is seen as dyslexic has a combination of one of 4 deficits in the way their neurology in the left hemisphere processes certain elements of language. Fortunately, those 4 neurological correlates of dyslexia are easy to find out. It's easy to screen a kid and find out whether they have one or more of them. Okay? So the net result is, because their wiring isn't the way it is for traditionally wired kids, their way of going about learning to read is different. So dyslexia now is often seen as meaning the same thing as persistent reading difficulty, if you want to call it that, or struggling readers, call it that. So that's what I'm talking about. In school, we should think about dyslexic kids as being kids who have these neurological features in the left hemisphere of the brain that make certain of the steps you have to go through to learn to read, that make those things different and harder. Okay, so then we got to know what to do about that. So then the other term I'm going to use is, I wish I had more time, because I'd like to sort of teach you a whole unit on this. It's a concept that we came up with at my school. All of our kids had really struggled in school, and they felt the damage that occurs when you think that you are not smart enough, or there's something wrong with you and you can't do this well. And so all of our kids had those issues. And many of them came to us with a diagnosis from the special ed department in their public school. And so they knew that they'd been diagnosed with a learning disability. A lot of kids didn't feel great about finding that out. I mean, sometimes they said, well, great, that means I'm not crazy. Okay, that's a good thing. But they weren't necessarily happy to say, oh, good, now I have a learning disability. And a lot of the conversation that we've evolved institutionally in our schools and in our state legislatures, where we write laws about how schools work with kids, and at the federal level, where we write a bunch of laws, it always seems to me that those conversations aren't sensitive to that issue. And as a teacher, it still seems strange to me. I know there are financial considerations, and we can't do this for every kid, so we have to have these rules and guidelines. But it also, at some level inside of my heart as a teacher, I have to ask myself, why does it make sense that we have to call a kid a bad name before we're willing to teach the way they learn best? I mean, we know how to do that, but we're not willing to do it until we do this. So we were looking for ways to think about these issues that kids have and how to talk about them in ways that promote better instruction, rather than in ways that tell us whether they qualify for extra help or not. So that was really our focus. So the terminology we came up with, I want to share with you. I'm just telling you because I'm going to be using this a bunch. So we call it the intuitive, non-intuitive learner concept, and here's the fundamentals of it. Everybody has some wiring that make them a great learner at some stuff. And if we had more time, I'd have each of you put down about 5 or 6 things that you're really good at, and it comes to you easily, and once you get it, you never forget it, and it's just, so that's the stuff you're intuitive at. And it's the stuff when it comes time for you to do that stuff, if your brain could make a face, it would be like, oh, goody, I love this stuff. Then we all have places where our wiring means there's stuff that we hate to do. We really don't want to do it. We're not very good at it, we can try and try and try, and we can build some sort of minimal functionality at getting decent at it for a little while. But if you leave it alone for a day or a week, what happens to that functionality? See, you already know, right? You know this. Yeah, so where you're non-intuitive, it's hard to get it. And once you get it, if you don't stay with the whole getting it process every darn day, you go back to where it's supposed to be, and it's gone. So what we did was we studied our kids in the areas where they were really intuitive, and then we started to include ourselves and parents. And we wrote down a list of about a dozen characteristics that define what it's like where you're intuitive. And we did the same thing about where each one of us is non-intuitive, where we looked at those characteristics. They turned out to be very useful. Because if you're a parent with a kid who's really non-intuitive at something that's very important to you or very important to school, knowing what their characteristics are, then you can take that and go to the next step, which is, well, if you are non-intuitive about, what kind of teaching would work best for you? What would maximize the ease with which you get the information in and maximize your ability to hang on to it, not have it go away? So that solved our problem. We wanted ways to talk about this that produced thinking on our part as teachers and parents that let us understand our kids better and teach them better and have them understand themselves. Kids need to know that all the adults in the world are non-intuitive with a bunch of stuff too. The people who really shine in school just happen to be lucky that their non-intuitive stuff is not the things that school cares about. Okay? But if your non-intuitive stuff happens to be stuff school really cares about, then you're not so lucky enough. Okay? So you'll hear me using that term, and it's really important about the readers to know that readers get wiring at birth that makes them non-intuitive at learning to read. And then we can take those ideas about, well, what is the best way to learn where you're non-intuitive, and turn those into reading instruction. Much of that driven by the science. Okay, so here we go. So I want to start out talking about context. So we live in a fortunate era right now where a body of research has been conducted over the last 35 years about the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. It's a sub-organization within the National Institute of Health, which then answers to the National Science Research Council. It is the group of agencies that the government turns to when they want answers about how to solve real problems that we can't seem to figure out with what the science is on, right? So we live in a context now where we have oceans of great information from these people. A lot of what I want to do tonight is share that and then talk about how that should play out in school. But a lot of the stuff that we're wrestling with right now about how we teach reading in school and how we try to help kids in school when the reading isn't going very well, a lot of that stuff is the consequence of decisions that were made about how to do this stuff long, long ago. And as I said earlier, there were decisions made based on genuine enthusiasm for new ways of thinking about teaching. That part was good. The bad part was that some of those insights applied to some students in some circumstances, but not to all students in all circumstances. So today we talk about those ideas, Dewey's ideas, as constructivist. And what that really means is the teacher, when doing constructivist teaching and learning, the teacher guides the child through experiences from which the child herself draws insights and information and constructs her own knowledge about this, whatever it is. So the kids take a major role in constructing their own knowledge. The opposite of constructivist learning is called didactic. That means as a teacher, they're telling you what you need to know and that you need to remember it. You got a test on Friday. Okay, so that's didactic instruction. It turns out where you are a non-intuitive learner, guess which of those two kinds of learning does not work very well for you? The kind where someone allows you to create your own understanding of how the language works. Because it's a highly procedural, highly complex problem, how reading works. And if you're non-intuitive at it, you can't figure that stuff out on your own. So if you have a constructivist teacher who's doing that with you in reading, your odds go down on how well this is going to work for you. But where you are a non-intuitive learner, What works best is a teacher who tells you exactly what you need to know, how it relates to the other things you need to know, and explains to you what you're going to have to do to internalize this so when you need to use it, it's still there. That's didactic teaching. Well, as a culture and as an educational profession, starting back in the 40s and the 50s, we began to move more and more and more to the idea of taking constructivist ideas and bringing them into our reading instruction. But there wasn't the science around at that time to tell us, well, wait, time out. It's going to work for the intuitive guys, but it's not going to work for the non-intuitive guys. And we currently live and work, if we're teachers and administrators, in schools that have committed to a lot of that over the years. And now we're wrestling with the fact that science has come along and said, that might not be the right way to do it. If you try it this way, you're going to get better results. So I think that context is very important. So we're going to take a little look at the context. So we're talking about instructional design and curricular choices that we've made as a culture about how we're going to teach and how we're going to ask our kids to learn. Well, we didn't have, mostly in the past, we haven't had good science to guide those decisions because the science, no scientists were looking at this stuff. It just wasn't there, so we're out of luck on that. Our tradition in the educational field is that we make these momentous decisions about how we're going to teach and what the curriculum is going to be based on what teachers, education leaders, political leaders, what their philosophy, feelings, and beliefs are about that stuff. And often, what I've noticed is that we as teachers tend to think the right way is the way that worked for us. So, if we were good constructivist learners, then that's what we want to see going on in our classroom. If we weren't, then we're okay with the didactic stuff. But it's probably not the right way to make decisions for the nation. All the schools. Probably ought to have some other stuff working for us. What people believe, the other problem with basing these decisions on what people believe is, what if a whole bunch of educators believe a certain thing and it's inaccurate? And you bring evidence to them that it's inaccurate. If their position is a position based on faith and belief, what do they think about your evidence? You have about as good a chance of convincing them as you do convincing your neighbor across the street, whatever their particular religion might be, let's say they're a Presbyterian, convincing them that you have a wheelbarrow load of evidence that if you would become the Episcopalian, it would be a much better religion for you than Presbyterian. Actually, your evidence doesn't matter because it isn't an evidence-based choice, is it? It's faith. Faith means not based on evidence. So when we do that in our schools, that puts us in a tough position. So there's religious faith point. And then if that's the case, then here's what you can wind up with. So everybody gives Dewey the credit for figuring out this whole constructivist thing, but it's actually a guy named Spencer in England who did it for about 60 years before Dewey did. Then Dewey brought it to America, and so we did. And then following what Dewey did, there's a guy who taught linguistics and other things at MIT, a brilliant man named Noam Chomsky. And he was a very sort of, we'd think of him as sort of a left-leaning kind of guy who had ideas about how those notions should play into the way we design schooling and teaching. And then Ken Goodman was a professor in Arizona who felt very strongly that the constructivist approach to learning and reading was the best way to go about it. So those people, and a lot of other people who believed in them as well, the president of the International Reading Association was a proud supporter of these ideas. And so was the president of the Association for Educational Research, or the top research organization. Almost every big professional organization in America that looked at schooling and education bought into this set of ideas. Now, if this were today, it might not have happened like that because the fundamental premise of constructivist learning in reading is this, and it's an error. Science has demonstrated that. The people who built the whole language approach to reading built it on the idea that kids can learn to read exactly the way they learn to talk, just by listening to adults do it. You really don't sit down and give very many lessons to your kids on about, today we're doing this workshop on how to talk. You know, adults do a lot of talking around them, talk with them. Pretty soon they start making noises. Pretty soon they begin to talk too, and by the time they're 5, you can't stop them from talking, right? So it is a very sort of automatic process, and there's a reason why that is there. So this approach to thinking about how to teach reading is based on the idea, what I call it the friction method of learning to read. And the friction method is this. You take children and reading, and you rub them together quite pleasantly over a relatively short period of time, and pretty soon they catch on fire and they read. All right? That is not a false statement, because there's a certain number of kids who are pretty intuitive at reading, and guess what? It works pretty well for them. They're so intuitive they fill in a bunch of the stuff that other kids might need someone to explain to them didactically. They learn it on their own. But it is not an across-the-board kind of thing. So why context matters is because it didn't have the science. It is a demonstrably false premise, and it's a neurological good learned talking. And today it is absolutely clear that is not true. But the world has not changed around that in terms of whether those ideas are still the main ideas in how we teach reading or whether they aren't. We'll remain more or less the same. Right, so context, where this comes from, it matters. What are our current circumstances? For 3/4 of a century in this country, students, parents, and schools have been living in educational circumstances in which a crucial cultural decision was made to value this particular kind of instruction and curricular design, and to value this above all others. And the result of that has been that we have severely disadvantaged the 20% of children in the population who are non-intuitive learners and who need didactic instruction. 50 million school children in America. 20% is 10 million kids. Might sound like a terribly high number to you, but the probability is that it's lower. If you want to take an external measure of whether that's way too low or way too high, consider this. About every 3 years, there's an outfit funded by the government called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And they go to schools, a representative sample of schools, lower schools, middle schools, high schools, all the way across the country, rich, poor, urban, suburban, and they measure how kids are doing on things like reading and math and that sort of stuff. They began in the late 60s. For as long as the National Assessment of Educational Progress has been reporting, the number of kids who read in America, who read at or below basic, that means well below 4th grade, has been 40%. And over the last 15 or 20 years, when there's been enormous government attention and parent attention and school attention to this particular issue, 40% of American people don't become very good readers, the numbers haven't improved. So there's an external measure. There is a serious issue about how we're doing this. Okay, so I mentioned this. In the 1700s and the 1800s, almost all formal education was totally didactic. You got a teacher who told you stuff, and then they found out if you could remember it. That's basically what it was. So Spencer and Dewey had this idea. It sounded incredibly appealing. It's very humanistic. Instead of having a teacher who's the boss and tells you, who sort of does education to you, forces this stuff on you, and you have to learn it and then prove that you know it. Their methodology allowed the teacher to be your guide, your coach, your facilitator, and bringing you to, as a student, to a place where you understood this stuff and made it meaningful to you. That's a lovely idea. I mean, none of us like people ramming stuff down our throat. And then in the last 20 years or so, this terminology has been generated to describe the change. So what happened was the teacher went from being the sage on the stage, who told everybody what they need to know, to being the guide on the side, who coached them along to get to the place where they need to get. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, Dewey's ideas were ever more broadly applied, but also misapplied in that they were applied universally. So the non-intuitive kids were getting the same stuff. In that process,